Blog Talk Radio.
It's Thursday, January 9th, 2014. This is the Hermetic Hour. I'm your host, Poke Runyon, and tonight we will review and discuss the new book by the Lebanese Christian author Karim el Koussa, Jesus the Phoenician. Now, this is a highly controversial subject. Karim's thesis is revolutionary, but quite possibly true. He sets out to prove by the Bible itself, the New and the Old Testaments, that Jesus of Nazareth was not a Jew, and that the God he called his father was actually the Canaanite El, not the Jewish YHVH, Jehovah. Well, this should be a very provocative and enlightening discussion. So, as we said in the abstract, tune in and get Salvation Phoenician style. Yeah. Okay. Now, Jesus the Phoenician by Karim el Koussa came out this year. And it's published by Sunbury Press. And this book, quite frankly, I will say this book has expressed something in very, very detailed and very convincing analysis that I have frankly suspected myself for a long, long time. And in fact, I had even outlined a novel based on the same ideas that Karim has put forth in this book. And relating Jesus of Nazareth right straight on back to our Canaanite seasonal ceremonies from Ugarit, in a straight line right on through. And I had planned to do this, but you know, I kind of held off on doing it because there wasn't enough factual backup. And now that Karim has done all this work and put this whole together, maybe I can actually go ahead and do this. Now, what he has done here, and I just review his thesis, and then we'll go through the way he's documented it. What he's saying, in essence, here is this: that Jesus of Nazareth was basically not a Jew, that he was a Canaanite, that he was a Phoenician, and that most of his disciples were also Phoenicians, and that his Father in heaven, that he talked to and about and preached to us about, was actually El, and El Latipan, El the Compassionate, El Elyon. That's A-L. It's spelled E-L in both the Bible and in English, but it's in Phoenician, it's Aleph Lamed. And this is the oldest word we have in Aramaic, Proto-Hebrew, Phoenician. This is the oldest word we have for God, and it's used all through the Bible as a synonym, and as a synonym for YHVH, oftentimes. But it's used in a standalone sense, and the plural of it, of course, is Elohim. Now, another full point here before I forget to mention it. Emmanuel, the name we often applied, or is often applied to Christ. Emmanuel, according to what Karim is saying here, really means Emmanuel of El. Emmanuel of El. In other words, El is at the end, Emmanuel, and El is at the end, and it is the way he describes it here is that it is a combination of Iman, and El, and that this is the Phoenician term for the coming prophet, what the Jews would call a Messiah, and they had a different word for it in Canaan. Now, another thing, before we go any further with this, it's necessary, because this is if you don't know your Bible and if you're not versed in this, this is difficult to get yourself wrap your mind around, because we're dealing with concepts here that need some background to be able to understand them. But one thing I want to explain before we get further into it is this: we have, and this is not just Christians and Jews but people in general, including Christians and Jews. We have and our Islamic brothers, we have a distorted perspective of what the Holy Land, what Palestine was really like culturally at the time of Jesus. We have a very distorted perspective of it. And that perspective of it is dictated by both the Old Testament and the New Testament that we have. And we tend to, as a result of our religious training and that which is accepted or more or less accepted by society, we have a very distorted idea of what was actually going on in a cultural or religious sense in that area. And until we remove the blinders from our eyes and look at it clearly and realize what was really going on, we just can't grasp this concept that Karim is putting across. Now, let me use an example. Robert Anton Wilson, who was a hippie, a writer during the hippie era, he wrote a great big 3-decker trilogy called the Illuminatus Trilogy, and kind of a psychedelic, mind-bending sort of a thing. And in the Illuminatus Trilogy, he proposed the concept of a punctuation mark that was invented by some Dutchman back in the 17th century. And this was a punctuation mark that you put around a sentence or around a word or around a phrase. It was a kind of like a little bracket, an offset little bracket, but it's a special punctuation mark. And he called this punctuation mark the fenor, F-N-O-R-D, fenor. And what it was, the intention of it was whenever you wanted to say something that wasn't true or was a distortion of the facts, you put fenors around it to indicate that this was really not what it was like. This was a specious statement. But so, according to the way Wilson was plotting the story, the fenors were used for 50 years or so. But then they became they were continued to be used, but nobody could see them. People were so conditioned to believe what they read that they couldn't see these little marks that were actually in there, and they blotted them out. Their minds were conditioned. And then one of the characters in the book, he's sitting on a park bench and he's reading the newspaper, and all of a sudden this light just dawns, and he suddenly jumps up and he throws his newspaper up and he says, "I can see the fenors! Oh, I can see the fenors!" Well, this book of Jesus the Phoenician it will, once you read it, you will really, you can read, then you read the New Testament, the Old Testament, and you can see the fenors. I mean, you will be able to see the fenors, because that's what Karim has done all through this book, is to show you where the fenors are. And he claims he's not a scholar, but actually he's done a very, very, very meticulous job. Now, I'm not trying to say that Karim is a punctilious academic. No, he's not, and he is. It's kind of slanted, and we'll get into some of the criticisms that academics would make of it later on. We'll be fair to the academics who will make a few criticisms, but basically, Karim has really shown you the fenors, and if you see the fenors, then you can see how the Holy Land really was at the time of the birth of Jesus, whom we call the Christ. All right? Now, here's what was really going on. In the first place, Karim establishes Ezra and King Cyrus of Persia wrote the Bible. They're the ones that put it together. It was put together for political purposes, and of course, when they put it together, they really loaded it with fenors. And the purpose of doing this was that Ezra, a Persian, very, very, very astute, his empire, of course, included Palestine. So what he wanted to do was to take these very, very religious-minded, nepotistic, very tight-knit clan of people that he had been displaced over into his area in Babylon, and take them back and put them down in the middle of Jerusalem and put them in charge as his clients, as his kind of not exactly covert, because but he had a reason for doing this, and he put them there, and then they would have that Temple Mount, and he would help them build this temple, second temple, and then they would be the spiritual and religious control of an area which he knew was a crazy quilt of tribes that believed similar things, but they were all, and like the Middle East is, they were all at each other's throats. They couldn't agree on anything. But Cyrus and Ezra wrote the book, and they knew, Cyrus and Ezra both knew, that if they had the book, and they had the Temple Mount, and they had the temple, that they would be the religious and cultural power in Palestine. So that's what they did. Now, some of the things some of the fenors that they used, and by the way, Karim does not use this term. He doesn't. I don't think he's ever read the Illuminatus trilogy. It's not the sort of thing he would read, probably. So he doesn't. He's not using the fenor term, but I'm using it to explain the process here. So they had the book, and the faithful could not see the fenors, of course. And we can't see them today either. We can see them now, but if we're enlightened. So what they did, they did all kinds of shenanigans with that book. Moses was it was actually the last of the Hyksos, although Karim doesn't say that, but that's true. But and the story of Moses and the bulrushes, hey, they got that from Sargon. Sargon was floated down in bulrushes. The stories about Solomon, they got that from the last king of Babylon. Several of the stories about Solomon, and they put this stuff together. They got Noah from the Babylonian story of the flood and Noah and the ark. They got that from them. They put all this stuff together, and so they had the book for virtually everyone in that whole region. This was the controlling book, the big book. And then, of course, that temple, that Mount Moriah, that was where the old Sun Temple for the Canaanites. Remember Melchizedek, which means actually Malach-Zadok, the king of the priest king of Salem, Jerusalem, and so they got that. The Babylonians tore that temple down, but that temple wasn't Solomon. I mean, Solomon. According to what Karim is saying, there never was a Solomon. I think there was, actually. I disagree with him on that. I think there was a Solomon, but he certainly wasn't a primary worshiper of Yahweh. Whoever Solomon or the king like him was certainly a devotee of El. And that's obvious from the Bible the way it is, even with the fenors. Because Hiram of Tyre, the Phoenician, when Solomon says, I want to build a temple to the Lord, and Hiram of Tyre says, praise the Lord. And, of course, in both cases, we're talking about El. So they built the temple to El. Now, that original temple, and here again, I'm adding something to what Karim is saying. That original temple was very much like the Kaaba in Mecca. It was a big square building, only the priests could go inside, and they had a big court outside where everybody did sacrifices and lathered and washed themselves and offered sacrifice outside. But the priests went inside, big square building, and inside, in the Kaaba, if you remember, there was, before Muhammad cleared it out, there was a great big Asherah right in the center. That was a lot. That was their version of a knot. And that big mother goddess, Asherah, in the center, and then all the way around were all the gods and the little boxes, the little arks, the little boxes for the gods of the tribes. In each tribe in Arabia, they had their little boxes, their little shrines, their little arks all the way around the circle around the mother goddess. And that was what was in the Kaaba. And that's the same darn thing that was in Solomon's so-called temple. It was, and except that probably there was a statue of El, and in the center of that temple, there was probably a statue of El, Bull El, and Asherah, and his consort, Asherah of the sea. And then surrounding that were all of the little gods, possibly including Yahweh, because he was a little tribal god in a box, and he was the tribe of Judah. The only two tribes that were taken off to captivity were Judah and Benjamin. Now, if you check up on the history of the tribe of Benjamin, you find out that tribe was completely reconstituted. They were slaughtered by the tribe of Judah and supposedly other Canaanite tribes, actually the lost tribes. The other tribes, and this is something. This is why we're breaking the mold here and looking at this thing the way it really was. the other tribes, the so-called 10 lost tribes, they're all Canaanites. They don't worship YHVH. They worship El. And the tribe of Benjamin, back before the captivity, even before Solomon's temple was built, the tribe of Benjamin did a horrible, horrible thing. And I'm not going to go into it. It's a gruesome, grisly story, and I don't want to go into it. But anyway, they did something horrible, and all the tribes ganged up on them and wiped them out until there was only about a few dozen of them left. And then all of a sudden they thought, well, we got to have 12 tribes, so let's let them go out and grab some Canaanite girls and repopulate the tribe. So they did. So then, of course, after that, they were under the control of Judah and the Levites. Well, then Judah, the Levites, and Benjamin, they were the ones carried off into captivity. And they're the ones that were there with Ezra and Cyrus writing the book and planning to come back and doing all that. Now, the Samaritans, the Good Samaritan, you heard that one. Well, the Samaritans, they got there a little bit later, and they had their own version of the book. Oh, boy, the cursed Cuthians. And of course, because they had their own version of the book, and where they got it, who knows. But anyway, so they settled in just northeast of Jerusalem. And the Judeans hated them and despised them because they had a version of the same book. But everybody else, all the rest of those tribes, were all basically Canaanite, had been and still were. Now that is the picture. Now, but then we have to add the Romans. So in come the Romans, and they take over. So the Romans take over, but being good politicians and, being good empire wielders and whatever, they take a malleable, rather decadent Jewish king, Herod, and they make him nominally the king of Palestine, Judea, and whatever, and of the Roman protectorate. And then this his rule and is enforced by the Roman army. And he has a governor there that he has to report to, but he's still the king. So what we have here is it's a plebiscite. It's the Romans and the Jews under Herod sort of running the whole shebang, and trying to keep a lid on all of these tribes that hate each other, and you can really readily see what's going on in the Middle East today is just about the same kind of thing. Up there in Syria, my God, there's that little tribe that Assad is Syria. There's a little tribe, but they're trying to run the whole country. The rest of the Syrians hate him, and so he's being attacked by everybody, all the other tribes, including the Druze, and they're all going after him. And it was the same sort of thing. But the Romans were classical pagans. Okay, not only that, Caesar was God. Okay, Caesar is the living God, the God on earth. He's like the Mikado. You got to work. You have to hail Caesar, and you have to hail Caesar and bow your head and say hail Caesar. If you don't, that's treason. And so everybody. So being classical pagans and wanting to have peace for economic purposes in the country, the Romans are enforcing a certain degree of religious freedom. Yeah, everybody can do their own thing, providing they hail Caesar and pay taxes and keep quiet and don't cause trouble. And, of course, naturally, the Jews are running the temple, but they have to put up with these other tribes, including the Samaritans, whom they don't like because they don't like the Samaritans' version of the book. And then there's the Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians are Canaanites, and of course they're still abominating. But the Jews have to a degree put up with it. That's the situation. That's the way it was. And it's very hard for us. We've been so conditioned to think of Jesus up there in Galilee, and they're all devout Jews and all that, and he's preaching in the synagogue, and he's a rabbi and all that. We've been so conditioned to think all of this, that think that it was all just one big happy Jewish family that didn't like the Romans and all that. But that's not what it was at all. So Karim is actually, he's very, very right in this. Now, he goes into a great deal of effort here to establish that Jesus really was not of the house of David, and that he was not Jewish, and that Mary and Joseph were not Jewish, and all of that. Some of that, as I say later, we'll question some of that. But and his disciples, he establishes that only Judas and Nathan were probably Jewish. The rest of them were Canaanite. Most of them fishermen, like Peter up there in the Sea of Galilee, frankly, he now understand too that this frankly, if this book had been written by a Muslim, I would be very suspicious. I would think that this would be anti-Christian Jewish propaganda. But no, it's written by a devout Christian, and Karim is a devout Christian. And even though he's a devout Christian, he is scrupulously honest enough to research up the probable aspect of the virgin birth, and here's how he reconstructs it. Oh, he's in favor of the virgin birth too, by the way. And he reconstructs it by Mary Yam. Yam being the god of the sea, Phoenician god of the sea. You remember seasonal ceremonies, into the Gulf of Yam we gaze, where even the gods must die. Yeah, well, anyway. So Miriam and Joseph, according to this theory, is a Phoenician priest, and Miriam is a temple a female acolyte, and they do what amounts to a hieros gamos in a Phoenician temple, and yet the way they choose to describe it is that the Archangel Gabriel appears and in a light, and then Joseph brings in bread and wine like Melchizedek, and they have communion, and Mary is enlightened and receives the Annunciation and all that. But that's if you're a little more pragmatic, perhaps, than Karim. He's allowing you. What Karim is doing he's allowing you to be pragmatic and say, that's a straight out hieros gamos. In other words, what we in modern terms call making a moonchild. And so Jesus, this explains, according to Karim, this explains why James was called the brother of Jesus, but James was in fact, according to the way Karim has it worked out, James was in fact Joseph's son by a previous marriage, which would make him Jesus's, and that's very possible. James, by the way, and he was really, no doubt about it, James was Jewish, and he didn't convert to Judaism or anything like that. He was, because he ran the church, he ran the Christian church in Jerusalem after Jesus died. And as you probably all remember, he and Paul had that big debate. Paul wanted to preach to the Gentiles and exempt the Gentiles from all of the various Jewish laws, including circumcision. And James argued vehemently against that. He wanted to keep Christianity a Jewish sect, at least in his jurisdiction, in his bishopric. He wanted to keep it a Jewish sect, and he wanted everything, but he gave in on circumcision. Well, and Paul, of course, here's another case. Paul's supposed to be Jewish, according to the Bible, and yet Paul was a Roman citizen. He was born in Phoenicia, and yet supposedly Jewish. Maybe not. But Paul certainly was persecuting the Christians. There's no doubt about that, until he had his epiphany on the road to Damascus, or whatever. But it should be noted, and as Karim does note, that, and here's another one of the fenors. Hebrew was only a dialect of Aramaic. Everybody in that area, everybody spoke Aramaic. And Hebrew, what they called Hebrew in those days, was just a dialect, a priestly dialect of Aramaic. And hey, the Zohar was supposedly derived from an Aramaic manuscript. It wasn't actually. Moishe Leon wrote it himself in 1360, but he said that it came from a 2nd century Aramaic manuscript. That's what he wrote it. And that's what Jesus spoke, Aramaic. In fact, that movie that Gibson made, that movie, they all spoke Aramaic, except the Romans. But that's what they spoke, and Jesus preached in Aramaic, and if he ever wrote anything, he wrote it in Aramaic. And also, the other major language that they were using was Greek. There was a lot. That's another thing. Alexander had been through that area, had conquered Tyre and all, and he had Hellenized that whole area to a great degree. Now, brings up a point, too. The Phoenician religion, even though they still have the seasonal ceremonies, they still resurrected the dying God, and just the way they did it and we did it, and back in 1500 BC, were still doing it. However, that religion of theirs had evolved considerably. And yet, even so, we have to consider that the resurrection, the death and resurrection of Baal, or his son Aliyin, or later Adon or Adonis, and the various names of what they referred to, the yearly death and resurrection of what we in the West would call the Green Man, was related to and perhaps influenced by or cognate with the death of Osiris. And yet, on the other hand, the difference was that Baal was resurrected and came back to earth each time, whereas Jesus, both Osiris and Jesus, were resurrected, appeared on earth, and then went up to heaven. And there's not too much difference on that, because where does Baal go after he's resurrected? He goes back up to heaven, and he's the thunder god, whatever. But the key to this is that the death and resurrection, and there was nothing resembling this in Jewish scripture, mythology, or anything like that. Nothing. This was strictly Egyptian, Phoenician, and then later on Greek. And so this is one of the key points that Karim makes. is that the idea of the dying and resurrecting God is a Phoenician idea. And he also points out, and this is a very telling case, that El, the over-god of the Phoenicians, was always referred to as El the Compassionate. El, and his consort, Asherah of the Sea, was the nurturing, compassionate goddess. And the only thing that El did that was at all naughty, no, not to say naughty, El came down one time, and this is the oldest, a 1,500-year-old Ugarit story. El came down to earth one time, and on the beach, he was walking along the beach, and he ran into a couple of beautiful young ladies, skinny dipping, and he cooked them a chicken, and then he had his fun with them after cooking them the chicken, and then he went back up to heaven. Oh, what does that tell you? I mean, here was a God who this wonderful, compassionate God for everybody. And by the way, he was God for everybody. He was not just a God for a chosen people. He was the over God of everywhere, of everything. And he also, he occasionally got drunk and enjoyed himself. But other than that, he was compassionate. And in fact, that was compassionate, but he was referred to continually as El the Compassionate, Latipod, and Elion, El. Whereas on the other hand, Jehovah is exactly the opposite. He's a bachelor. He doesn't have a wife. He doesn't get drunk. He doesn't diddle with girls on the beach and roast chickens. I mean, he doesn't do any. And he's vengeful. In fact, at one time or another, he calls himself jealous. That's his name, is jealous. And he is strictly the God for the Jews. That's it. That's all. And he's their God. And of course, when he first gets started, obviously he's there are other gods, obviously, because even the Ten Commandments say, "You shall put no other God before me." But so there were other gods, but he was theirs, and so this is El, who was still very much being worshipped at the time of Jesus. El was obviously the God that Jesus was calling his Father. Now, Karim is establishing this, but he's doing it very carefully. He's doing it very carefully and doing it primarily out of the Old Testament as we have it, and the Synoptic Gospels. He gets into the apocryphal Gospels, the Gospel of James, and a few things like that. But mainly his proofs are coming out of the Synoptic Gospels and the Old Testament. Now, one of the things, of course, he really emphasizes is that when Jesus confronts Pontius Pilate and all, Jesus, he never says that he's Jewish. In fact, he says he really implies he's not, and he implies that, and he strongly implies that he is not the King of the Jews, and he implies he won't. He keeps saying that his God is of another kingdom, and that he's not the Jewish Messiah, but he is the messenger of the over God of everybody. Makes that very clear, and so the fact that the Jews, the Sanhedrin turned him over to Pilate and asked Pilate to execute him, indicates that no, he wasn't Jewish. However, I'm going to say this, that even though Karim is being staunch in here about Jesus having no Jewish blood at all, I think that's an exaggeration because, even in the Bible it says several times he didn't really want to go to Judea, and when he was going to go down there, his disciples told him, don't go to Judea, they'll stone you. Don't go. But he did because he thought he had to. But they did try somehow or other, either his disciples or him or both, tried to spread the word that he was of the house of David. I'm sure they did that because otherwise they wouldn't have even let him in. I mean, he couldn't have even gotten started. And certainly he couldn't have gone into the temple and turned over the tables of the money changer and all that. Maybe even, that unless he had some kind of Jewish bona fide, or at least claimed to, he wouldn't be able to do anything. So I think that there was. I would think that they at least were trying to claim, probably trying to claim. Very much so, like McGregor Mathers in the Golden Dawn. He really wasn't McGregor. He was Samuel Liddell Mathers, but he wanted to be a Scottish laird so badly that he managed to figure out some kind of a distant relationship to the clan McGregor, so he could call himself Samuel McGregor Mathers and be the laird. You see, I think that's probably what Jesus did. They probably because. Really, nobody in Europe can trace their genealogy back any further than the Crusades. They can't. And nobody in Judea, believe it, and nobody could trace their genealogy back any further than the captivity. I mean, the house of David and Solomon and Samuel, and that's all. That's pretty much a myth, and it's a carefully constructed myth, and so if as we said, that temple in Jerusalem, that first temple was a temple to El, and it probably hosted a number of tribal gods. We already have the model for that. We know how that works, and so Solomon, King Solomon was, whoever King Solomon was or wasn't, was a powerful Canaanite king who allowed the little box with Yahweh in it to be put in the temple. And maybe gave them a particular time when priests could go in there and they could have their day or their hour or their whatever. And that's about as much reality as we can assume for it. So Jesus, when you start talking about those House of David lineages, they could have, and they probably did make up something or assume something in that regard. And let's put it this way on the book. That book, what we call the Bible, what they call the Torah, what we, New Testament and Old Testament, that book is tremendously powerful. It still is. That book has its own reality, whether you can challenge it. You can say, okay, it's myth and all that, but it has its own reality. It has tremendous power. And whoever is in line with and wielding the book like an authority, and has the authority of the book, is very powerful in the religious area. So I think Karim would probably agree that book was influential all over Palestine, in the Canaanite areas too. Now, to bring that up, Karim also mentions, and this is dear to my heart, he mentions the book of Enoch, the original book of Enoch. That's what we would call the Ethiopian Enoch. and if Rob Sullivan's listening, he's going to enjoy this, that book of Enoch was actually Canaanite, was actually Phoenician. And that Enoch, of course, was not a Jewish, but a Canaanite prophet. And he got a very good argument for that, because Mount Hermon, where all of those fallen angels came down, and their big flying saucer, and they all come down and landed up there and squatted on top of the mountain and said, what are we going to teach these people? That mountain, Mount Hermon, is way up there in Lebanon. And so this, Enoch, the book of Enoch, even though we ended up, in order to find an original copy, we had to go all the way to Ethiopia. But that book was very probably, as Karim says, very probably written in Phoenicia, and it is Canaanite book. So that's we can say that's Canaanite scripture. And Enoch is certainly, and Enoch is equated. He equates Enoch with Taudus, and Taudus, of course, and with we would call Kusor, with the Canaanite gods. Now, by the way, I want to mention that people have wondered. Some people have wondered, and I've used as a magical name and have for many, many years. I use Fabian as my magical name. Now, Fabian was, according to the Phoenician philosopher, writer, Sanchuniathon, Fabian was the first hierophant of the Phoenicians in ancient times, and that's where I got that. So it's not a knockoff on Therion, which means beast in Greek. It's not. I'm not trying to go on the coattails of the master Therion or anything like that. Now, Fabian comes from Sanchuniathon, and so let's talk a little bit about Sanchuniathon. Sanchuniathon is our other main source on Phoenician philosophy and religion and mythology. And we only have it in fragmentary form and copied, and we have a later copy from a Greco-Phoenician writer from Byblos, Eusebius. He was the scribe who, he was the compiler who summarized the writings of Sanchuniathon. And we get it's about 500 years after Ugarit. That's about 1,000. Although some people say later, some people say 500 BC. But now I think the thinking is probably around 800, about around the time of Solomon. Whereas you want to put this in biblical perspective, Ugarit, where we get our original seasonals, Ugarit, that's 1500 BC. That's before Abraham. That's way back. But Sanchuniathon is around, and Melchizedek, that's about the same time as Ugarit. Abraham, his communion from Melchizedek. And Melchizedek was Canaanite. He was a priest of El. And that same temple right there in Jerusalem, that big box, stone box up on Mount Moriah, that was Melchizedek's temple. And he gave Abraham, who was Abram at that time, the first communion. And now, of course, how many times does it say in the New Testament that Jesus is a priest after the order of Melchizedek? This is another telling argument. And Melchizedek is obviously pre-Yahweh. He's obviously a Canaanite, obviously priest of El. All right. Now, Sanchuniathon we have this fragmentary short summary of his work, but unfortunately, a German writer by the name of Wagenfield came out back in 1836, I believe. Wagenfield came up with a Sanchuniathon hoax and published what he claimed was an original manuscript that they'd found, some Portuguese guy had sent him and all of this. And this was the real story of Sanchuniathon, or the Sanchuniathon's writings. And so in 1836 and 37, and all the way up through until Wagenfield was revealed as a forger, Europe and America, we wanted a great big Phoenician kick. And these are the mysteries of the Phoenicians and all that. And but they didn't have Ugarit at that time. We didn't have Ugarit. So this was, and of course, Gustave Flaubert with Salon Moïdrou on this and everybody else, and whatever. And they had a huge Phoenician fad going with this. And then it was revealed that this was a forgery, and Wagenfield had made it up. So, ever since then, what we do have of Sanchuniathon has had a sort of a stigma on it, and people, just the whole scholarly community just said, "Oh well, we don't know anything about the Phoenicians, forget them." But then, of course, in the late 1930s, they discovered this huge library of Ugarit, and by the time the war was over, in the 1950s, they started translating it. And by the 1960s, they were available in English. And that's about the 1970s, we were writing Phoenician seasonal ceremonies, which we've been performing ever since. And now, I want to tell you something about that. And Karim mentions this too. These ceremonies, the same ones that we reconstructed, were being practiced all the way up to 300 years after Jesus died. Up there in Afaka, where the water comes out of the mountain and hits the gorge and turns red, where Jesse Weston said was the origin of the Holy Grail. These ceremonies, the Adonia especially, the summer ceremony where the god is slain, had been practiced all the way up to 300 years after Jesus died. And St. Chrysostom raised a gang of tough guys and mercenaries, and they went and slaughtered all of these devotees up there, and that was the end. That was the last Adonia, until we resurrected them in 1974. Now, so consequently, this book, even though I can, we can make some criticisms of it, but even so, I am very, 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 very pleased with this. And he's written another one. He's written a novel, which may have even more interesting speculations that he are called The Phoenician Key. And I certainly want to get that and read it. And we want to really support Karim in this. And it's excellent book here. Now, to be fair, I think there was. It's reasonable to say that there was some interpenetration. Jesus probably, I think personally, Jesus probably did have, could claim or did try to claim some Jewish blood, and that seems fairly logical. So I think Karim is being a little too exclusive in that regard. Other than that, his also too, he seems to think Marcion, the Christian mystic Marcion, who was I'm Gnostic, but it was a strange version of Christian Gnostic, strange version of Gnosticism. He seems to think that Marcion is a good successor, and I can't go along with that, because I think the Hermetic philosophy is much closer to Sanchuniathon, much closer to the original seasonals, and Hermetic philosophy works, to me. It looks like that works much better in the Phoenician area than Marcion, although definitely Jesus certainly fits in, and Jesus. And I was kind of joking a little bit with one of my Christian colleagues who in our order, and I said, well, now that Karim has done all this work for us here, we could even call ourselves Phoenicia Christians, because we could have Jesus. We can finally include Jesus in the old tradition that goes all the way from Hiram of Tyre all the way on up through to the resurrection, and so next week we will delve into the deeper secrets of the Book of Enoch in relation into the Phoenician pantheon, and also by that time we'll have some more material on this. And so next week, Secrets of the Phoenicians. And until then, good magic.